To start off, we have mastication, which is a fancy word for chewing. So we have the word mastication. And this is a form of mechanical digestion. When we take the food inside our mouth, we chew it up, and that's mechanically breaking down the elements of our food, right? But we also have some other organelles inside of our mouth, inside of our cephalic region, right? We have some glands that produce saliva, and we call them the parotid glands, the sublingual glands, and the submandibular glands. Now, these three are composing the salivary glands that we have inside of our oral cavity. And what they do is they secrete saliva with digestive enzymes that you guys probably know as amylase. It's got salivary amylase. And that helps break down the initial components of your carbohydrates. Okay? It also contains other immunological properties such as lysosomes that help filter out any elements that may become pathogenic in our system, but it's just very mild. Okay? The food, as it starts propelling downward, it starts being propelled by this structure right here, known as the esophagus. Okay? And the esophagus carries out a wave-like movement that propels food downward, and that wave-like movement is known as peristalsis. Okay? Please understand that we have a mucosal lining inside the esophagus, which allows the food to glide through down towards this little muscle right here, which we call the lower esophageal sphincter, or the cardiac sphincter, because of its closeness, its anatomical closeness to the heart. Well, they're separate structures, but cardiac sphincter. After the bolus of the food is allowed to go inside the stomach, while it's passing through the cardiac sphincter / lower esophageal sphincter, it actually opens up so the bolus can go inside the stomach, and then it closes to prevent any gastric reflux. Any of the gastric content is going to be preventing from coming back up into the esophagus because of that lower esophageal sphincter. Once the bolus hits the stomach, it's going to encounter a bunch of fluids inside, and those fluids are highly acidic. The book says, your ATI book says, that the pH, the power of hydrogens of the stomach acid, should be less than 4. However, it can be as low as 1. So just keep in mind that the acid inside of the stomach is meant to protect us from microorganisms, and also to break down the properties of the basic foods that we consume, such as proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Although fats really get helped out by bile, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. So within the lining of the stomach, you have rugae. Those are those folds that allow the stomach to expand. And when it expands, it stretches out, and it sends a signal via the nervous system to the brain that tells us, oh, you know what? We're now full. We're full. And so that's what helps us stop eating. Okay. Now, inside the mucosal lining, the tissues inside, you have these specialized cells. And those cells include your parietal cells. And your parietal cells, what they do is that they secrete hydrochloric acid. Okay? You also have something called chief cells. And your chief cells, they secrete something called pepsinogen. Now, pepsinogen is a precursor to pepsin, which is the acid. And when pepsinogen goes inside of our gastric content right here, inside the fluid, and it meets up with hydrochloric acid, they link up to produce pepsin. And that's how we keep our gastric content to become very acidic. Okay? And remember, folks, that when your pH is, when we're talking about acidity, the pH is low. Okay? We also have something called G cells. Oops. And the G cells produce something called gastrin. And gastrin is another digestive acid that we have inside of our stomach. And then we have these other cells known as enteroendocrine cells. And those ones release little chemical messengers that regulate all the other cells, and it tells them to either increase or decrease its production so we can regulate the gastric content, primarily talking about the pH, right? The gastric acids. The bolus of food that enters inside the stomach is now, when it mixes with all these chemicals, is now known as chyme. Okay? And then we find ourselves with another small, a lower muscle down here called the pyloric muscle, the pyloric sphincter. Now, I drew these little red lines to also distinguish that that is also a muscle, and it opens and closes so it can facilitate the gastric dumping or the gastric emptying into the smaller intestines. So, excuse me. So right here, this muscle right here is known as the pyloric sphincter. Okay? Now, once digestion begins, we talk about the movement of the chyme into the smaller intestine. Keep in mind that the small intestine, which is illustrated by these little squiggly lines, is represented by, it's going to be DJI. It stands for, the first one is the duodenum or the duodenum, the jejunum, and then of course the ileum. It's important for you guys to understand that the small intestine is where about 90% of your digestion occurs. I'm talking about the absorption of the smaller elements that make up our food, such as our amino acids, our monosaccharides, glucose, and of course our fatty acids. Okay, let's discuss now the role of the pancreas, because the pancreas is an organ that's behind the stomach. Okay, it's kind of located in this little area, and it's connected to the duodenum, to the duodenum. And the pancreas plays an important role because it releases digestive enzymes. And those digestive enzymes are as follows. So if we talk about the pancreas, and if we talk about the digestive enzymes, we're discussing something called amylase. And amylase plays an important role in the absorption of the breakdown molecules of carbohydrates. And then we have trypsin. Trypsin plays an important role in absorbing the breakdown molecules of proteins. And then we have lipase. Lipase plays an important role in the breakdown of the absorption of the broken down particles of fats or lipids. So it's very important for you guys to understand that these are the digestive enzymes. The pancreas has two primary roles. It has an endocrine function and an exocrine function. Right now we're talking about the exocrine function because the exocrine system is composed of ducts, meaning little tubes, passageways that the cells within the actual pancreas utilize to pass on through those digestive enzymes. So keep in mind, folks, that right now we're talking about the pancreatic function in regards to its exocrine function, not its endocrine function. Now, keep in mind, I want to break something down real quick or explain something real quick. In order for the pancreas to release those digestive enzymes into these little tubules right here that have to make their way into the duodenum, there has to be free-flowing tubes, meaning there has to be patency. So if at any point the pancreas becomes larger, such as in pancreatitis, it's going to start squeezing those ducts and it's going to be unable to release that gastric content. This is important because when we discuss disorders like pancreatitis, you're going to note that the patient's serum amylase increases. That's because these ducts that are supposed to release the digestive enzymes into the duodenum, well, they're being plugged up. And so the amylase starts backing up and it starts being spilled out into the bloodstream, the digestive enzyme chemicals. And that's why we use that as a laboratory indicator of pancreatitis. And we use amylase simply because it's a better clinical indicator, better clinical marker. But we'll discuss that in more detail when we talk about the disorders. So the pancreas produces one more thing. It produces bicarb. Okay. Now, bicarb is alkaline in nature, meaning the pH is higher when alkaline or when bicarb is being released. Now, the reason why bicarb is also being released is because it's mixing in with that chyme so we can try to neutralize the acidity. The whole purpose of bicarb in the pancreatic role right here is so it can be released and so it can mix with the digestive content, meaning your chyme, your food stuff. And as it's going down the intestinal tract, the small intestine, it's being, the digestive enzymes are breaking down the elements like carbs, proteins, fats, so they can be broken down into their basic elements. And the bicarb allows to neutralize the acidity. So just keep that in mind. Another component that I want to discuss real quick is this little bad boy right here. Now, this right here is known as the gallbladder. And the gallbladder is really important because simply because it releases something called bile. And bile is really important. Bile is what allows the fat cells or the fat globules within the intestinal tract to become emulsified. So bile emulsifies fat, meaning it breaks it down into its basic fatty acids. So the lipase can then help absorb it into the microvilli, into the small intestine, into the small intestinal cells, so it can be absorbed into the vascular system. Now I'll discuss that in just a bit as well. So if you guys think of water, a cup of water, if you sprinkle some oil in there, notice that the water and the oil kind of separate from one another, meaning it's hard to go inside the actual fat, inside the actual oil, because of the hydrophobic properties, right? It keeps water away. Well, bile, it actually is able to penetrate the fatty substance and break them down to the basic amino acids, and that's what emulsification means. So every time you guys think about bile, think about emulsification, and that is the separation of fat from its properties when it gets broken down to its basic amino acid properties, so then lipase can be able to absorb it. Now, let me pause right there real quick and discuss what happens when we have absorption. Generally speaking, the intestinal lumen looks like this, right? This is the outside. This is the smooth muscles that we have, the mucosa, the submucosa, the serosa, all that stuff, right? All the muscles that allow for peristalsis to occur. Well, notice the little red and blue lines. Those represent the capillaries that are embedded within the muscular tissues. Whenever we have any type of elements that are passing through our digestive system, let's pretend that this is it right here. As it's going through, you have the cilia and the microvilli that are actually propelling the elements through, and they're trapping the small molecules, the basic breakdown of metabolism. We're talking about amino acids for proteins, we're talking about monosaccharides for carbohydrates, and we're talking about fatty acids for fats. Those elements get absorbed, and there's cells inside, and those cells help bring in that element, and they bring it into this little finger-like appendage, okay, that's going to be inside the actual lumen of the intestinal tract, and those elements get absorbed by the capillary system. Notice we have three basic elements here. The green are your lacteals, and your lacteals are part of your lymphatic system, and they help transport lipids, okay? Also, they help us with our immunological system, and that's why they say that you are what you eat, because a high abundance, I believe it's up to 60% of your lymphatic organs, including the nodes, are inside your gut. That's why it's very important to be careful with what you eat, because you're constantly bombarding your immune system if you're eating crappy food, which I do also. We also have the blue component right here, and that's going to be, of course, the venous system, and they're part of the capillaries that form within the actual finger-like projections of the intestinal tract. And that's going to be, of course, your veins, okay? And then we have the red ones right here that represent your arteries. Now, of course, these are smaller arteries, so we talk about venules and arterioles, but nonetheless, they're in there. And that's what's helping absorb and transport all that nutrients, guys, all that waste, metabolic waste, okay? Now, as the substance that we consume continues to pass on through the small intestine, the acids are being neutralized, and we have all these digestive enzymes, including the bicarb that's released by the pancreas. By the time the substance inside the small intestine is leaving into the large intestine, keep in mind it's still liquid. I'll write down liquid right here real quick. It's still in its liquid form because that's what it has to be in so it can be absorbed, and we have the max absorption occurring in the small intestine, right? Well, then it leaves and it goes inside the first segment of the large intestine called the cecum, right? Oh, and keep in mind that right here you have the vermiform appendix, which I forgot to mention real quick. The liquids containing all of these substances pass on through. Now, what's supposed to happen is that as the substance continues to pass on through the ascending, the transverse, the descending, the sigmoid colon, and eventually down to the rectum and anus, what ends up happening is the water is being reabsorbed. These elements are being reabsorbed. And those are basic elements, meaning that they're bicarb, they're base. So it's important for you guys to understand that the substances that are inside the larger intestine, even though the pH of the content is roughly 6 to 7, if you have diarrhea and you expel all of those elements that are basic, well, now you lost all your base and you develop metabolic acidosis. So it's important for you guys to understand that in the large intestine, the pH of the substance, I want you to think of it in this fashion, that there's a lot of basic components in there, a lot of alkaline components. So what's supposed to happen is they're supposed to be reabsorbed into the system so they can maintain the serum pH, right? 7.35 to 7.45. But if you have elements like diarrhea, well then you poop it all out, you're losing them, you develop acidosis. And if that's a little bit too difficult to remember, if it comes out of your ass, you have acidosis. And essentially, folks, that's what's happening in the GI system. In the next video, I'm going to be covering the functions of the liver and more functions of the pancreas, and I'm going to be discussing disorders as well.